Hey friends, gather close. Tonight, Mort want to tell you about a bobcat named Luma, whose tiny, fierce curiosity would make her think she belonged behind every door she approached. The wind had been relentless all day, sweeping down the mountain ridges in sharp gusts that made the pines groan and sway, as if sharing a secret with the cold air. Thomas had lit the lantern on the porch, its soft yellow glow fighting the gray twilight, casting long shadows over the frost that had settled like sugar over the worn wooden steps. That was when he first saw her, a small, spotted shape, crouched low, ears twitching, tail flicking in sharp little swishes, eyes bright and liquid as they caught the lantern light. She chirped once, a cracked, half meow that made his chest tighten. You probably would have walked right past her. Most people did. Her paws left delicate impressions in the thin snow, each step careful, deliberate, as if she were measuring whether the world outside the woods was trustworthy. Thomas knelt, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs with the scent of pine and damp earth, the faint metallic tang of winter pressing close. The bobcat didn't run. She only paused, head tilted, ears forward, and let her bright amber gaze linger on him. The way she crouched there, small and fragile, yet so impossibly alive, pressed against something Thomas had stopped knowing he could feel. The quiet ache for a connection to something wild, unclaimed, and utterly sincere. He had lived alone for nearly 12 winters, his companions only the forest and the slow hum of his own routines. There had been moments, countless really, where he thought the wild things would never pause for him, never trust his presence or care. Yet here she was, a frozen blur against the fading day, waiting as if she already knew he was someone who could understand her without words. If a story like this softens your heart, take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely love what we share here at Wild Hearts. And if you re-watching from somewhere special tonight, leave a comment below with the name of an animal that once changed your life. Thomas edged closer, careful not to startle her, and set a small scrap of leftover chicken on the step. Her nose twitched, eyes narrowing, as she inched forward with a cautious grace, whiskers brushing the wood in soft arcs. The snow crunched under his boots, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a soft chirp and nudged the morsel with one delicate paw, tasting it and then retreating slightly, as though deciding if this human, this strange creature who smelled of smoke and wool and the old kettle in his cabin, could be trusted. He watched, feeling the warmth of the lantern against his face and the ache of something tender and unfamiliar in his chest. Even in the cold, there was a hush that wrapped around them, the kind of quiet that feels like the forest itself is holding its breath. Thomas wondered how many others had passed her by, eyes averted, feet too quick, hearts too busy. Most people never saw the small, patient magic in moments like this, but he did. And in that quiet twilight, with the wind rattling the pines and the snow settling around them like a gentle promise, he felt something stir inside, a fragile, hopeful certainty that sometimes the wild things choose you. The bobcat circled the step once, ears flicking, tail twitching. They kept each hat precise little beats, then plopped down on her haunches and blinked slowly, golden eyes fixed on him. Thomas extended a hand, palm low and flat, and she sniffed it cautiously. A tiny, almost imperceptible chirp echoed from her throat, and he exhaled, without realizing he had been holding his breath. The lantern cast a halo around them, making the snow sparkle like shards of glass, and for the briefest moment, the world narrowed to the sound of her soft breaths and the rhythm of the wind. Her head tilted again, almost imperiously, as if checking that he understood the rules of this first fragile interaction. She would watch, she would test, and she would decide the pace. Thomas smiled softly, feeling the corners of his own heart relax a fraction. There was something delicate and persistent in her confidence, something that hinted at the mischief and courage yet to come. He had stopped believing the wild things would stay, and yet here she was, perched like a tiny sovereign on the snowy step, demanding attention with nothing more than a look and a cracked little chirp. The wind picked up, rattling the lantern S-glass and stirring the pine boughs above, and she crouched low, shifting her weight, tail flicking twice in rapid succession. Thomas could see the tension in her muscles, ready to bolt, but she stayed. Trust was not given freely in the wild. It was earned in measured, meticulous beats, and already, in those first golden minutes, something had begun. A silent promise hung between them. He would wait, she would watch, and perhaps, if the world allowed, she would let him in. So pour yourself something warm, find your softest blanket, and let the world go quiet. This is a story worth hearing slowly. And with the lantern light still glowing, snowflakes settling around their small tableau, Thomas whispered her name gently, Luma, and she chirped back, a tiny, fragile acknowledgement, a sound that seemed to fold into the hush of the evening itself. Thomas thought back to the time, before Luma found her way to his porch, before the world had brushed past her, as though she were nothing more than a shadow. She had come from the ridge beyond the creek, where the old pines grew close, and the winters were long and merciless. The wildlife officers had found her there, thin to almost nothing, coat mottled and matted, and eyes wary beyond her young age. They said she'd been separated from her mother early, driven out by hunger, and scratched by rival bobcats as she tried to find food. A tiny scar traced the curve above her left eye, a subtle mark that hinted of hardship, yet didn't diminish the brightness of her amber gaze. Thomas had seen her photograph before the rescue, but nothing in that sterile image captured the quiet defiance that had kept her alive. When she arrived at his cabin, she was silent, a bundle of tension wrapped in a spotted coat, ears flattened, tail curled tightly around her legs. The first night she refused food, turning her head from every offering and letting her soft, almost inaudible chirps echo into the empty cabin. Thomas had placed a small heating pad in the corner and left a thin fleece blanket draped over it. He watched from across the room, nursing a chipped blue enamel mug of tea, the steam curling in gentle spirals, carrying the scent of pine from the hearth. He could hear the subtle rasp of her breathing, every tiny shiver marking the aftermath of her time in the wild, a life measured by survival, not comfort. The smell of wet fur mingled with the tang of the cabin wood and the lingering pine smoke from the stove. Thomas noted every twitch of her whiskers, every flick of her ears, cataloging her gestures with quiet awe. Even in the shadow of vulnerability, there was a spark of audacity in her, a mischievous tilt of the head, a slow blink that seemed to say, "Mote notice everything, human." He had stopped believing the wild things could trust, could lean toward warmth instead of away from it. And yet, as he settled into the chair across from her, cup in hand, a tiny pulse of hope pressed against the walls of his chest. Over the next days, the cabin filled with subtle signs of life. The first breakthrough came with the soft crunch of kibble, sprinkled carefully on the floor. She approached, tentative, paws pressing lightly into the rug, tail flicking in quick, uneven beats. The moment she allowed her nose to brush the food, Thomas felt a quiet swell of triumph. Not victory over her, not conquest, simply acknowledgement. She had chosen to take this small step on her own terms. She returned to the corner after each bite, chest rising and falling, whiskers trembling, yet the line of tension across her back began to ease fractionally. He began leaving small treats on the porch steps, watching the way she inched closer that day, always stopping a paw's length away. Her ears twitched at every sound, the wind skimming over the ridge, the creek murmuring beneath ice, but she never bolted, not once. Thomas marveled at the resilience in her posture, the mixture of wariness and curiosity. He realized slowly that the scar above her eye did not just mark her past. It was a signal of survival, a banner she bore with quiet dignity. The thought settled in him, comforting and sharp. The wild could be cruel, but it could also carve out strength that glimmered unexpectedly. There were small, unexpected moments of charm as well. She would chirp in sequences that seemed almost musical, matching the rhythm of the dripping water from the eaves, or she'd paw gently at the hem of his wool socks, her tiny claws tickling, but never harming. Once, she dragged a piece of string across the floor, circling it like it were prey, then stopped abruptly to gaze at him, as if inviting a shared joke in the language of wildness. Thomas laughed softly, the sound breaking into the quiet cabin, and she chirped again, a short, clipped sound that carried a hint of approval. These were the gestures that stitched the fragile beginning of trust between them. The days were long, sometimes slow, measured by cautious steps and gentle encouragement. Thomas had learned to read her micro-expressions, the flick of a tail that signaled suspicion, the gentle lean toward a hand that indicated burgeoning confidence, the way she would pause at the threshold of each new space, calculating whether to cross. And slowly, gradually, she began to explore beyond the corner, first the kitchen floor, then the area near the hearth, always with measured care, ears flicking like tiny antennas, tuned to the unseen world around her. Evenings were quiet, filled with the smell of simmering tea, the hiss of the wood stove, and the soft, rhythmic chirps from the bobcat as she found new corners to claim. Thomas would sit nearby, savoring the warmth of the room, noting the way her amber eyes caught the light, how her tail flicked twice when she felt secure, and how she eventually allowed herself to stretch fully, exposing her belly in brief moments of vulnerability. He had stopped believing the wild things would stay, yet now, sitting with her, he understood that trust was a delicate tapestry, built stitch by patient stitch. By the end of her first week in the cabin, there was a quiet rhythm forming. Luma's eyes would follow Thomas across the room, ears occasionally pivoting at his smallest movements, tail curling and uncurling in a slow, deliberate measure. She chirped softly at the stove, at the falling snow, at the wind, rustling the pines outside, marking her presence and claiming the space without aggression. And Thomas realized, with a gentle, tremulous warmth, that she had begun to see him not as an intruder, but as a companion, a keeper of safety, however temporary or fragile it might be. The tiniest, most subtle glimmer of connection had been struck, a spark that promised more than mere survival. The forest outside remained wild, cold, indifferent, but inside the cabin, something tender was forming, the first threads of a bond that would define months to come. Thomas rested his hands on the blue enamel mug, feeling the warmth seep through his palms, and watched her tilt her head toward the window, ears alert to every sigh of the wind. For the first time, he felt that the world had paused, even for a moment, to allow the wild and the human to find each other, to understand that trust could exist, even in the shadow of hardship, and that some hearts, once opened, could never fully close again. The first encounter that truly cemented their fragile rapport happened on a crisp morning, the kind where frost clung to every branch and the sky was pale with early light. Thomas had just stepped out to check the mailbox, the weight of the steaming mug pressing comfortably into his hands. Luma was perched just beyond the porch, a small shadow crouched against the snow, ears swiveling at the crunch of his boots. Her tail twitched once, twice, in that rapid, rhythmic beat that Thomas had come to recognize as her private code for curiosity mixed with caution. She made no move toward him, yet she did not retreat either. Instead, she sat back on her haunches, head tilted, golden eyes, tracking every step with deliberate precision. Thomas lowered himself onto the lowest porch step, careful not to make sudden movements, the enamel of his mug clinking softly against the wood. He whispered her name, testing the gentle cadence of syllables, and she chirped back, a thin, melodic sound that seemed part question, part statement. She inched closer, nose twitching at the scent of his wool coat and the faint traces of pine smoke that clung to him. Her paws sank lightly into the frost, leaving perfect, delicate prints that told a story of both hesitation and intent. Thomas marveled at the balance she struck. Vulnerable yet bold, wild yet willing to risk a step into this strange, human-scented space. For the first hour, they studied one another in near silence. The forest beyond the porch whispered with wind through the pines, a soft, constant backdrop to the tiny, intimate theater unfolding on the snowy boards. Luma's ears flicked toward every creak, every rustle, but she never bolted. Instead, she circled cautiously, tail flicking twice, each time she paused to examine a new scent or shadow. Thomas felt the odd mix of exhilaration and reverence that comes when you witness a truly wild spirit at close range, a creature whose movements are poetry in their own right. She eventually crouched low, belly almost brushing the snow, and padded forward a few inches. Thomas' hand hovered near the step, palm down and open, offering no sudden gestures. Her whiskers twitched against the cold, damp air as she sniffed lightly, then recoiled just enough to test boundaries. It was a moment of negotiation, neither party forcing, neither retreating, each measuring the other with careful, almost ritualistic movements. The chirp she emitted then was soft, almost pleased, a musical punctuation in the hushed morning. Thomas allowed himself a small, contained smile, feeling the first real thread of connection slip taut across the space between them. She made a circuit around the porch, brushing past the railing, sniffing at the cracks in the wood where frost had formed, her tail curling high and twitching twice when she sensed safety in the proximity of his presence. Thomas sat still, noticing the little gestures, the way her left ear flicked toward a crow in the distance, the subtle sway of her head as she scanned the yard. These were signs of intelligence, of awareness, of personality, and he drank them in, heart quietly swelling, vekepitehat both admiration and a gentle protective instinct. After several cautious circuits, Luma paused at the threshold of the door. She crouched, body tense, and chirped once more, clearly debating whether to cross the invisible line between wild and domestic. Thomas held his breath, feeling the snowflakes settle on his sleeves, smelling the crisp winter air mixed with the lingering aroma of the hearth. Slowly, she stepped forward, one paw at a time, pressing her soft pads to the cold wood, tail flicking twice before she finally settled just inside the doorframe. The warmth from the cabin enveloped her, and she paused, amber eyes scanning, whiskers quivering, body curled slightly in cautious relief. Thomas knelt low, whispering her name again, and she chirped, a higher, more insistent note this time, almost an acknowledgement, almost a greeting. He could feel the subtle relaxation in her shoulders, the ease in the muscles of her legs, and realized that trust, fragile and precise as it was, had taken its first tentative hold. She sniffed his sleeve, then swiped her head gently against his palm in a fleeting gesture of acceptance, just enough to bridge the gap without forcing intimacy. He marveled at the small miracle. The wild thing had chosen to inch closer, to risk engagement, to say, without words, Moat will let you in. Throughout that morning, she explored with delicate precision, pawing lightly at the edge of the rug, brushing against the door frame, circling the hearth, and chirping intermittently as if narrating her own tentative story. Thomas noticed how she would always pause after each exploration, tail flicking twice, ears swiveling, eyes bright, as if evaluating both the human and the room itself. He realized that this was her way of calibrating safety, a complex dance of observation, instinct, and choice. And in the hush of that snowbound morning, he felt an echoing gratitude. For the patience she demanded, for the trust she offered in the smallest gestures, for the quiet, fierce life that had found its way to his doorstep. By the time the sun had lifted slightly higher in the sky, casting pale gold through the frost-laden pines, Luma had made her first complete circuit of the porch, paws tracing delicate patterns in the snow, tail flicking twice at Moat each pause. Thomas exhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain from his shoulders. He had watched her every nuanced movement, every delicate decision, every tiny acknowledgement, and he understood that something profound had begun. The first encounter had not been a rush of affection, not a declaration of submission. It had been an intricate negotiation of trust, a soft weaving of mutual acknowledgement that would form the foundation of months of companionship to come. Over the next few days, Thomas noticed that trust was being built one small, deliberate gesture at a time. The first real breakthrough came during a late afternoon, when snow was melting into icy puddles along the porch, the sky a bruised purple-gray, and the wind carried the faint, resinous scent of the pines. Thomas had left a small plate of treats on the step, a mix of shredded chicken and soft kibble. Luma approached slowly, tail flicking twice with a nervous rhythm, whiskers trembling in the cold. She paused short of the plate, sniffing the air, then stepped back, as if testing whether this human offering was safe to accept. Thomas knelt low, hand resting lightly on his knee, keeping his movements minimal. He could hear the tiny crunch of frost beneath her paws, the soft rustle of her coat as she shifted, and the faint chirp she gave, a clipped sound that seemed part frustration, part encouragement for herself to take the risk. He held his breath. She inched forward, nose brushing a morsel, then lifted her head sharply to glance at him, eyes bright and questioning. Thomas nodded softly, the warmth from the mug in his other hand, radiating through the cool air. Finally, after a moment that stretched longer than minutes, Luma nudged a piece with her paw and began to eat, ears swiveling to catch every sound. Thomas allowed himself a small smile, a quiet chuckle even, and murmured encouragements. It was to just that she was eating. It was that she had made the choice to cross the invisible boundary between wariness and trust. That first tiny meal became a ritual, a subtle pact. From that day forward, she would approach the treats with measured caution, glance at him, and chirp once, a private acknowledgement that she understood he meant no harm. The moments of trust deepened with small gestures of intimacy. One morning, Thomas discovered that she had taken a single item from the cabin, his left wool sock, slightly damp from the snow. He found it draped over the arm of a chair, paws tucked beneath it as if it were a treasure she had claimed. Luma was nearby, tail flicking twice, eyes bright with a hint of triumph, ears alert, watching him with all the solemnity of a judge overseeing a court of her own rules. Instead of scolding her, Thomas laughed softly, kneeling to retrieve the sock. She chirped at him, almost delighted, as if to say, "See, Moat can outwit you, human, and it is glorious." This playful act marked another subtle breakthrough. She was beginning to treat the cabin, not as a trap but as a shared territory, a place where rules could be bent, where curiosity could take precedence over fear. Thomas started to notice the small quirks of her behavior, the way she napped only in sunlit patches along the porch floor, the careful way she inspected Iaj's hat crack in the doorframe, the precise rhythm of tail flicks that signaled her moods. He learned to respond to them with quiet patience, letting her dictate the tempo of interaction, and he marveled at how ma-u-shi-jhat communication could exist without a single word exchanged. He set about creating micro-rituals that reinforced trust. A tiny saucer of water always in the same corner, a warm fleece laid across the chair near the hearth, a soft hum of conversation while he worked in the kitchen. She would watch him closely, head cocked to one side, ears swiveling like tiny radars, tail flicking twice each time he made a deliberate movement. Sometimes she would chirp as if narrating her observations. Sometimes she would low pay lightly onto the step, testing the boundaries of proximity. Thomas had long ago abandoned any expectation of immediate affection. Each small advance, each delicate choice to remain near him, was a triumph measured in heartbeats and soft, shared breaths. One afternoon, as snow fell again, layering the porch in its quiet hush, Thomas set down the plate of food and watched her approach. She paused at the threshold, tail flicking, whiskers quivering, and then, in a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture, she brushed her head lightly against his outstretched hand. Thomas felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the cold air. It was a gentle, tender acknowledgement. "Moat trust you enough to let you be near." She chirped again, soft and short, then returned to her meal, ears swiveling to monitor the world outside. He realized that these tiny, deliberate acts were her way of choosing him, day by day, moment by moment. Evenings brought quiet companionship. Thomas would sit in the worn armchair, a mug of tea in hand, while she circled the porch, brushing against corners, patting across the wooden floor, tail flicking in subtle rhythms. Sometimes she would pause mid-step, gaze fixed on him, and chirp, a musical punctuation in the hush of the cabin. Thomas would respond with soft words, the faint murmur of his voice like a bridge, and the room would settle into a shared rhythm. The soft hiss of the stove, the smell of pine smoke, the faint crunch of snow outside, and the gentle breathing of a wild heart beginning to trust. It was a delicate dance of patience and observation, of offering space and accepting boundaries. Thomas had stopped believing the wild things would stay, yet here she was, inching closer a hot day, weaving her presence into the quiet routines of the cabin. Each small gesture, a nudge, a chirp, a stolen sock, was a thread in the growing tapestry of their bond. And as he watched her circle the porch, tail flicking twice, vikepatehat, each pause, whiskers brushing the frost, Thomas understood that trust, once earned, could be a gentle, persistent force, softening even the most cautious of wild hearts. It was during one of those quiet mornings that Thomas first truly appreciated Luma's mischievous streak. The snow had melted into patches of slush, and the air smelled faintly of wet pine and wood smoke drifting from the cabin stove. He had just poured himself a fresh cup of tea into the chipped blue enamel mug he always used, the steam curling in soft spirals, when he noticed something amiss. One of his wool socks was missing. At first, he thought it had fallen behind the chair or slipped beneath the table, but then a faint movement caught his eye. Luma, perched on the edge of the porch, had the sock draped triumphantly over her tiny shoulder, her amber eyes shining with unmistakable pride. She chirped once, sharply, as if daring him to challenge her. Her tail flicked twice in quick succession, a rhythmic punctuation that Thomas had come to understand as a signal of playful defiance. He laughed softly, the sound warm and low, and knelt to retrieve the sock. She darted just out of reach, whiskers twitching, ears flicking forward in anticipation. And Thomas realized he had stumbled into the first real moment of unguarded personality she had shared with him. The small act was more than mischief. It was a declaration of comfort, a playful bridge across the invisible line of trust that still separated the wild from the human. Over the next hour, Thomas watched her antics unfold like a gentle living comedy. She would pounce lightly on the sock, then retreat a few steps, tail flicking, ears swiveling toward the wind, as if to make sure the world approved of her claim. Every so often, she would chirp, a short, clipped note of self-satisfaction, then freeze mid-motion to examine him with bright, intelligent eyes, measuring his reaction. Thomas realized that these small, whimsical acts were Luma's way of communicating. She was learning the rules, bending them just enough to see how he would respond, and in doing so, she was teaching him about patience, observation, and the subtle joys of shared life. This playful ritual became a daily highlight. Socks were only the beginning. She developed a habit of circling the porch, nudging the corner of his slippers, testing the edges of the doorway, or pawing lightly at the hem of the rug. Each movement was deliberate, each chirp carefully timed, as though she were orchestrating a quiet conversation in a language only the two of them could understand. Thomas often paused mid-sip of his tea to watch, heart quietly swelling. They kept had affection and awe. Even in her small, teasing mischief, there was a profound intimacy. She was revealing herself, revealing trust, and revealing a personality that defied the caution he had long associated with wild creatures. One chilly afternoon, Thomas left the sock deliberately within reach, curious to see what she would do. Luma approached cautiously, nose twitching, tail flicking twice, and then, to his delight, she carried it to the sunlit patch near the hearth, dropped it with careful precision, and settled on it like it were a treasure chest. She chirped softly, a sound that Thomas had come to interpret as satisfaction and pride, then pressed her cheek lightly against the wool, paws tucked beneath her. He knelt nearby, careful not to disturb her, and felt the warmth of connection, radiate quietly through the room. These small, whimsical acts had become the scaffolding of a fragile but enduring trust. Even in the silence of winter afternoons, Luma's subtle antics carried a deep emotional weight. Each playful theft, each gentle chirp, each tail flick was a thread weaving her presence into the tapestry of the cabin. Thomas observed her with quiet awe, the way her amber eyes followed the steam curling from his mug, the way she paused mid-step to sniff the air, tail flicking twice, at mote each decision point, the way she returned, again and again, to inspect the perimeter of her human space. He felt a soft, persistent warmth in his chest, a reminder that trust could be playful, mischievous, and utterly intimate, even in the smallest gestures. The stolen sock became an emblem of their growing bond. It was a tiny, tactile symbol of connection, mischief, and acceptance. Thomas would often find her curled atop it, tail wrapped neatly around her body, whiskers twitching in dreams only she could see, a faint chirp escaping now and then. He realized that this small, quirky habit was more than entertainment. It was a language of comfort, a demonstration that she felt safe enough to express herself fully, to claim space, and to assert a tiny dominion within the cabin's cozy walls. By the end of the week, Thomas had come to understand the subtle rhythm of Luma's personality. Cautious but playful, observant yet impulsive, tender in small gestures, and unflinchingly confident in her whims. The stolen sock, the chirps, the tail flicks, all were punctuation marks in an ongoing story of trust, a living narrative that he was privileged to witness and, in his own quiet way, reciprocate. Each act of mischief carried a soft, unspoken promise. She was here, she was choosing him, and she was ready to teach him, in her own gentle, precise way, what it meant to share a life with a wild heart. Morning light filtered softly through the frost-laced windows, brushing the cabin in pale gold, and Luma had already claimed her favorite sun patch along the porch floor. Thomas watched, from the worn armchair, the chipped blue enamel mug steaming gently in his hands, the faint scent of pine smoke curling through the warm air. She stretched lazily, paws extending with delicate precision, tail flicking twice before she settled into the warmth, eyes half closed, whiskers quivering as though measuring the sun's heat. These quiet routines, the rhythm of tea, the warmth of sunlit patches, the faint hiss of the stove, had become their shared cadence, subtle yet profoundly intimate. Each morning began with rituals both tender and endearing. Thomas would open the door, letting in the crisp mountain air, and Luma would approach with cautious grace, circling the porch once before settling near the step. She chirped softly, a short musical note that seemed almost conversational, and he would respond with gentle murmurs, words measured and calm, almost part of the room's soft hum. Sometimes she would paw at his coat, nose brushing lightly against wool, tail flicking twice in rapid succession, a delicate acknowledgement of his presence, a subtle insistence that the world outside the cabin could wait a moment longer. The smell of brewing tea mixed with kepi hot pine smoke and the faint scent of damp fur as she moved across the porch, each step deliberate and precise. Thomas would leave small morsels near her chosen sunlit spot, watching the way she would sniff carefully, then settle to nibble, whiskers twitching with kepi hat each bite. Occasionally, she would pause mid-chew to glance at him, tail flicking once, ears angled like tiny radars catching the subtlest shifts in the cabin's atmosphere. Those brief exchanges, the shared gaze, the quiet presence, became their unspoken dialogue, a slow, steady weaving of trust that did not need words. Some mornings held playful surprises. She might low pay lightly onto the railing, tail swishing in a precise rhythm, eyes glinting with curiosity, or bat gently at the corner of the rug before retreating to her sunlit patch. Thomas learned to read these micro-movements. A tail flick meant attention, a soft chirp suggested contentment or a question, a pause mid-step signaled evaluation. Each gesture was an insight into her mind, a window into her wild heart, and Thomas found himself marveling at the intelligence and subtle humor that she carried in every motion. These routines were more than daily repetition. They were lessons in patience and observation. Thomas had once believed that wild animals could never truly find comfort alongside humans. Yet here she was, curling her paws in the sun, tail flicking twice after Shea hat paws, eyes tracking his movements with quiet curiosity. He noted the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the twitch of her whiskers at the faintest creak of floorboards, the way her ears would rotate to catch distant sounds. Each morning unfolded like a delicate choreography, and he cherished every carefully measured step, every whispered chirp exchanged in the hush of the cabin. Even mundane moments held unexpected warmth. While Thomas readied his tea, she would circle the hearth, inspecting every corner, paws silent against the wooden floor, tail flicking twice before pausing to watch him. Occasionally, she would bat a stray thread from the rug, whiskers quivering, ears swiveling toward the kitchen. In these small acts, he saw her comfort growing, the cautious distance between them gradually shrinking as she allowed herself more freedom, more engagement, more play. There was humor in her movements, tenderness in the way she chose to interact, and quiet reassurance in the rhythm they had developed together. By midday, the cabin would hum with gentle life. Steam rose from the stove, tea warmed his palms, and Luma would stretch fully in her sun patch, chest rising and falling in measured beats, tail curling around her paws. She occasionally chirped, a musical punctuation that marked her contentment, or pawed at the edge of the rug with careful precision, tail flicking twice, as if checking the world for approval. Thomas, in turn, would respond with soft words, low chuckles, and gentle attention, building a dialogue of trust, patience, and small joys. It was a life measured in microbeats, the flick of a tail, the chirp of a soft note, the quiet acknowledgement of mutual presence. As winter deepened, these rituals carried a quiet emotional weight. The sun-patched porch, the steaming mug, the scent of pine smoke, and the soft rhythm of Luma's movements created a sanctuary where both human and wild creature found reassurance and delight. Thomas realized that this daily life, slow, deliberate, and intimately observed, was the foundation of everything to come. Trust was not a sudden pay, but a sequence of shared routines, each one reinforcing connection, each one teaching patience, each one revealing personality in the smallest, most telling gestures. By evening, as light softened into pale indigo and the lantern's glow warmed the porch, Luma would curl along the edge of the rug, tail flicking once, ears swiveling to the faintest creak of the cabin floor. Thomas would watch quietly, feeling a swell of gratitude and quiet awe at the life they were creating together. In those simple, repetitive moments, tea, sun patches, soft chirps, and careful tail flicks, he found the profound, enduring joy that only comes when a wild heart chooses to linger close, slowly, deliberately, and entirely on its own terms. Afternoons became a kind of ritual theater, and Thomas often found himself smiling at the smallest moments of Luma's peculiar, endearing habits. She had discovered a certain fascination with the porch threshold, positioning herself just so, head tilted, ears alert, tail flicking twice in rapid, precise beats, and watching the world outside with the solemnity of a tiny mail carrier. No bird or squirrel escaped her attention. Even the wind skimming over the ridges seemed significant to her, each gust measured, evaluated, catalogued. Thomas began to refer to it quietly as porch vigil, a private joke that honored her serious dedication to her self-appointed duty. One chilly afternoon, Thomas carried a mug of tea out onto the porch, steam curling in soft spirals, and watched as she leapt lightly to the top step, whiskers twitching at the faintest sound of a passing crow. Her tail flicked twice, sharply, ears pivoting forward, and she gave a soft, clipped chirp that seemed to communicate both alertness and pride. She settled into her post, paws tucked beneath her, eyes unwavering, and Thomas realized that this ritual was more than mere play. It was an expression of personality, intelligence, and the kind of quiet joy that grows from feeling safe enough to claim space on one's own terms. The wind rattled through the pines beyond the porch, carrying the scent of melting snow and earth, and Thomas felt a warmth seep into his chest. Watching her, he noted the subtle behaviors that defined her personality, the precise sway of her tail, the careful positioning of her ears, the tiny chirps that seemed almost conversational. Even as she surveyed the forest beyond, there was a comfort in the familiarity of the cabin, the repeated rituals, the predictable presence of a human who never rushed her, never forced affection, only offered gentle companionship and the steady rhythm of daily life. Luma's porch vigil became a fixture of their afternoons. She would settle into her sunlit spot near the doorway, head tilted, whiskers quivering with the movement of the wind, and tail flicking twice in quick, deliberate beats. Thomas would set down his mug and sit nearby, careful not to disturb her, listening to the faint crunch of her paws against the wood, the subtle murmur of her chirps, the sigh of the wind through the trees. The world outside could wait. This small shared moment, wild creature and human, side by side in quiet observance, was enough. Some days she would engage in small performances, circling the porch, step 3 times, tail flicking twice at Iajahat paws, then leaping lightly onto the railing to observe the yard beyond. Thomas learned to anticipate these movements, recognizing her rhythm and responding with soft words, careful gestures, and attentive observation. There was humor in her precision, tenderness in her focus, and a profound sense of companionship that emerged from these repeated, almost ceremonial acts. Even her chirps, clipped and musical, seemed to punctuate the unfolding story of their trust, each note an affirmation of her comfort and growing affection. It wasn't all solemnity. Occasionally she would break character, pawing at a stray pine cone, chasing it in tight circles, tail flicking twice before pausing to glance at Thomas, as if to share a private joke. He would laugh softly, low and warm, the sound echoing across the porch, and she would chirp once in response, ears swiveling, whiskers twitching, her entire body expressing a subtle delight. These small bursts of playful energy reminded him that trust could be both serious and whimsical, measured and mischievous, and that each layer of her personality unfolded in moments of intimate observation. Evening would descend gradually, casting long shadows over the porch, the amber glow of the lanterns softening the edges of the snow outside. Luma would settle back into her threshold vigil, chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate breaths, tail curling neatly around her paws, ears pivoting with the slightest sound of the world beyond. Thomas would sip his tea quietly, inhaling the faint scent of pine smoke and damp fur, marveling at how she had taken hot ownership of the space without coercion, without demand, yet with absolute authenticity. By the time the lantern-esque glow flickered against the window panes, the porch vigil had become more than routine. It was a quiet expression of life, personality, and shared trust. Thomas could see her bright eyes glinting as the snow began to fall in fine, delicate flakes, her tail flicking twice, ears swiveling at every subtle shift in the wind. He had stopped believing the wild things would stay, yet here she remained, perched like a tiny guardian at the threshold, a living reminder that patience, respect, and gentle attention could cultivate bonds stronger than fear, deeper than caution, and utterly enduring. Even in the midst of their deepening routine, Thomas began to notice subtle signs that all was not entirely well. Luma's energy had always been measured, but now there were moments when she hesitated mid-step, ears flicking rapidly, tail curling tightly around her paws as if bracing herself. She began to favor her right front paw slightly, pausing longer than usual before pressing it to the wooden porch, and sometimes she would retreat quickly from areas she had previously explored without hesitation. Thomas' chest tightened at these small deviations, the kind that might escape notice in a more casual observer, but carried enormous weight for someone who spent every day reading the micro-signals of a wild animal-esque body language. He recalled one morning in particular. The snow had glazed the porch with a thin layer of ice, the wind pushing flakes sideways, scenting the air with wet pine and wood smoke. Luma approached her sun patch, nose twitching, tail flicking twice, but when she landed, she paused abruptly and lifted her paw, inspecting it as if uncertain whether it could bear her weight. The usual rhythmic patrol of the porch was interrupted. Thomas knelt nearby, breath clouding the frosty air, watching the careful, almost deliberate hesitation, and felt a prickle of worry creep through him. The small, measured behaviors that had once been signs of comfort now hinted at discomfort. Over the following days, he became more observant, cataloging her every movement. The subtle limping when she circled the railing, the way she sometimes avoided the threshold where sunlight usually warmed her paws, the faint chirps that were now sharper, quicker, almost anxious. He tried to keep his own reactions calm, speaking softly, leaving extra scraps and water, but the knot in his chest grew heavier. He had learned that wild creatures rarely vocalized distress. It was their posture, their micro-behaviors, their tiny shifts in routine that spoke volumes. And Luma's small deviations were speaking clearly enough to pull his heart taut. One late afternoon, as the wind rattled the cabin's eaves and carried the sharp scent of frozen earth through the air, he noticed her sitting at the threshold, tail flicking twice in quick beats, ears swiveling like tiny satellites scanning for danger. Her amber eyes, usually alert but serene, now darted constantly, reflecting attention that Thomas could not soothe with soft murmurs or gentle gestures. He knelt on the porch, careful not to startle her, and extended a hand slowly, palm down. She sniffed cautiously, but pulled back quickly, whiskers vibrating with uncertainty. The moment was brief, but it punctuated the subtle shift he had been feeling. Luma was signaling discomfort, and he needed to respond with both attention and patience. Thomas began adjusting their routines, offering extra warmth and quiet observation. He left additional fleece pads in sunlit areas, ensured fresh water was always near, and gave her space whenever she seemed hesitant. Still, the limping persisted, subtle but undeniable, and she occasionally refused treats that she had always accepted without question. The faint chirps, once playful, now carried a note of worry. He knew that even a minor injury or hidden discomfort could escalate if ignored. Wild creatures were stoic by necessity, and he had long ago learned to read what they would not say aloud. There was a quiet, almost reverent tension in the cabin during these days. Thomas' own movements were slower, more deliberate, attuned to the micro-rhythms of her body and behavior. He noted the flick of her tail, the pivot of her ears, the minute pauses mid-step. The wind outside rattled against the eaves, carrying the scent of damp pine, and the snow continued its slow, silent drift onto the porch. Luma's eyes followed every sound, her posture slightly lower, tail flicking with a careful rhythm, whiskers quivering as she assessed each minute shift in the environment. The subtle signs were enough to keep Thomas vigilant, patient, and acutely aware of her fragile well-being. Despite the undercurrent of unease, there were moments of gentle reassurance. When Shifu chose to approach the food he set out, she did so cautiously, but with the faintest flicker of recognition in her amber eyes. Tail flicking twice as if to punctuate each measured step, she allowed him brief contact, a paw brushing against the rug he had laid for warmth, a soft clipped chirp that seemed to acknowledge his presence and effort. In these delicate micro-moments, Thomas felt both the weight of responsibility and the quiet wonder that they were navigating this delicate balance together. Learning to read each other's signals more precisely, tending to trust even when shadows of discomfort threatened the harmony they had built. He realized that the subtle warnings she displayed were not obstacles, but opportunities, invitations to deepen his attentiveness, patience, and care. The forest outside remained untamed, indifferent, but inside the cabin, every cautious step, every tail flick, every careful pause became a language, a dialogue, a bond strengthened by observation and quiet respect. He had stopped believing that wild things could stay. Yet Luma persisted, signaling need and vulnerability while testing the boundaries of trust and safety, teaching him anew what it meant to honor a heart that was fiercely, quietly wild. The morning she disappeared was quiet in a way that made the heart ache before it even understood why. Thomas had risen early, lantern in hand, the air crisp and scented faintly of pine and melting snow. He called her name softly, the syllables curling into the dim light like a whispered hope. Normally, she would appear almost immediately, tail flicking twice, ears swiveling at his voice, paws padding lightly across the frosted porch. But that morning, the porch remained empty, the snow untouched, undisturbed by the delicate prints she usually left, seemed to mock him with its silence. He stepped onto the cold boards, scanning the perimeter, heart tightening vekepite hot each. Passing. Second. Luma had never strayed far without his awareness, never ignored the invisible tether that had grown between them. Now there was nothing but the wind rattling through the eaves and the soft sigh of the forest beyond. He knelt, feeling the chill of the snow through his gloves, and called her name again, voice low, careful, almost pleading. His chest ached with an unfamiliar, raw tension, the first true hint that trust could not always shield against the unpredictability of the wild. Thomas spent hours walking the surrounding woods, boots crunching against icy underbrush, lantern casting a circle of warmth across the frost-covered terrain. He paused frequently, ears straining for a chirp, a shuffle, a sign. Each rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made his pulse quicken, hope and fear twining in a knot in his chest. The sun rose higher, pale and muted through the gray clouds, and still there was no sign of her small amber eyes or familiar tail flicking in response to his presence. With every passing hour, his worry deepened, layered with guilt he could not name, a whispering fear that the fragile trust they had painstakingly built might have been undone in a single moment of vulnerability. By afternoon, Thomas had traversed familiar trails, scanned frozen creek beds, and called until his voice grew hoarse. The snow continued to fall lightly, blanketing the ground, erasing tracks as quickly as they appeared, and with it, his certainty began to slip. Each shadow between the trees, each movement in the underbrush, sent a spark of hope, only to be extinguished when it proved false. He paused on a ridge, wind whipping pine needles across his shoulders, and felt the deep, quiet ache of longing, the realization that trust, no matter how nurtured, could be fragile when confronted by the expanse of wilderness. Hours turned into a tense gray dusk. Thomas returned to the cabin, lantern swaying in one hand, footsteps silent against the boards, scanning the porch for the slightest sign of her return. There was none. He set down the lamp, hands trembling slightly, and whispered her name into the fading light, the syllables barely audible over the soft whisper of snow against the trees. He leaned against the doorframe, feeling the cold seep through his coat, and tried to steady his breathing. The absence of her delicate tail flicks, her clipped chirps, the faint rhythmic beats that marked her presence, was an unfamiliar void, heavy and sharp. Night fell, deep and quiet, the cabin bathed in lantern glow and shadow. Thomas sat in the worn armchair, sipping lukewarm tea he scarcely tasted, listening to the faint hum of the forest around him. Every rustle of the wind, every creak in the floorboards set his heart racing. He could not sleep, could not rest. The bond they had cultivated in sunlit rituals and shared warmth now hung in delicate balance, threatened by absence. He kept glancing toward the threshold, imagining her bright eyes and flicking tail appearing at any moment, but the silence stretched, unbroken, a weight that pressed against his chest with steady insistence. He thought back to every subtle sign of discomfort from the past days, every hesitation, every pause, every careful inspection of the porch and cabin corners. Perhaps she had wandered further to find space. Perhaps a hidden discomfort had driven her from the familiar threshold. Perhaps the wild beyond had beckoned too strongly. Thomas could not know, could only feel, and in that feeling, heartbreak and hope mingled, an uneasy tension that held his chest tight, and his mind restless. Each thought circled back to her amber eyes, the gentle chirps, the flick of her tail, the small, intimate signs that had built the foundation of their bond, now absent, leaving only longing. He spent the night listening to the wind, imagining the faintest chirp as it echoed through the snow-laden trees, heart straining for any hint of her presence. He whispered her name into the dark again, careful not to lose hope entirely, careful not to surrender to the creeping ache of fear. In the quiet, he realized that the depth of attachment he had felt for this small, fierce creature was profound, threading through each morning, sun patch, each playful theft, each porch vigil. And in the stillness, he promised himself that he would search until dawn, until the forest revealed her, until the delicate rhythm of trust, however fragile, could be restored. The search began before the first blush of sunlight touched the ridge. Thomas laced his boots tightly, wrapped his scarf against the crisp mountain air, and stepped into the snow-laden forest, lantern swinging gently in his hand. Each footfall left a sharp, crisp imprint, but he paid more attention to the ones that weren't there. The delicate, familiar paw prints of Luma that usually marked the porch and the path to the trees. He whispered her name as he moved, voice low and steady, carrying over the frozen earth, mingling with the faint sigh of wind through the pines. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of branches, set his heart racing, vecipite hot equal measures of hope and dread. Hours passed as he threaded through the forest, eyes scanning the underbrush for her amber gaze, ears straining for the faintest chirp or rustle of movement. He called her name again and again, letting it ripple through the trees, imagining that she might be hiding nearby, curious yet cautious, fearful yet drawn to the familiar cadence of his voice. The snow deepened beneath his boots, each step more laborious, and he paused often, listening, holding his breath at every whisper of sound. The forest was vast, indifferent, and yet he felt that the bond they shared could guide him to her if he only stayed patient and alert. He remembered the small, subtle signals from the past days, the hesitation of her paw, the careful tail flicks, the clipped chirps, and tried to read them like a map of her current state. Was she injured? Had she ventured too far in the cold? Or was this a cautious exploration of the wild she had known before meeting him? Each possibility weighed heavily on him, each unanswered question, a thread of anxiety tightening around his chest. Yet he pressed onward, moving slowly and deliberately, careful not to startle any signs of her presence. By mid-morning, Thomas had combed through familiar paths and less traveled ridges, calling her name into the wind, voice raw and hoarse, but met only with the echo of his own words bouncing back from snow-covered trunks. He paused at a frozen creek, water flowing faintly beneath the ice, and listened to the subtle hum of the forest. The scent of pine was strong here, mingled with damp earth and the faint trace of something he hoped might be hers. He knelt and pressed his gloved hand against the snow, imagining her delicate paw falls, and whispered her name again, letting hope cling to the syllables like frost to branches. Time blurred as he traversed ridges, inspected fallen logs, and scanned every nook where a small bobcat might hide. The light shifted slowly, shadows stretching longer across the snow, and Thomas felt the ache in his chest. Deep in Vey, kepite het each empty pause. The quiet desperation of his search mingled Vey kepte hat vivid memories of their routines. Sunlit patches, stolen socks, tail flicks, porch vigils. Each moment now a stark reminder of her absence. Every rustle of the forest, every distant bird call, carried the sharp pang of possibility, and he clung to each sound with a fragile, aching hope. Late afternoon brought frost-dusted exhaustion. Thomas rested briefly on a fallen pine, the wind rattling through branches, snow crunching softly beneath his boots. He tried to recall every detail of her movements, her habits, her quirks. The way she chirped when she was content, the deliberate flick of her tail twice in succession, the measured exploration of corners. Each memory became a compass needle in the gray expanse, guiding his attention and sharpening his instincts. He whispered again, voice breaking slightly, letting the forest hear the plea he could not keep contained within the cabin walls. The day drew on, and Thomas combed further along the creek and ridges, scanning for the faintest flicker of amber eyes or soft patterned coat against the white snow. Every shadow of pine and brush seemed to offer a flicker of hope, and yet none revealed her. Exhaustion pressed at his limbs, but he could not stop. Each pause was filled with imagining her small form, tail flicking in measured beats, ears pivoting in attentive rhythms, chest rising and falling with delicate precision. The ache of absence mingled with steadfast resolve. He would search until the forest yielded a sign of her presence. By evening, the sun had dipped low, painting the ridges in soft violet and gold, and Thomas returned to the cabin for a moment of respite, lantern in hand. He scanned the surrounding snow-laden landscape, chest-tight with the quiet desperation of a rescue, berated from a wild companion, and whispered her name into the wind one last time before darkness fully claimed the forest. Every memory, every stolen glance, every chirp and tail flick lingered vividly in his mind, a map of connection, guiding him toward the hope that, despite the heartbreak of absence, their bond had not been broken. The morning she returned was almost surreal, painted in the soft gray of early dawn. Snowflakes drifting lazily through the air, each one catching the lantern light like tiny sparks. Thomas had almost stopped hoping, almost allowed despair to settle into the rhythm of his heart, when he spotted movement at the edge of the clearing. A delicate spotted shape emerged from the underbrush, ears swiveling, tail flicking twice in quick, deliberate beats, chest rising and falling in measured rhythm. Luma had returned. She paused at the line of trees, bright amber eyes fixed on him, scanning, assessing, yet unmistakably her, unmistakably here. Thomas knelt instinctively, letting the lantern-esque glow warm the space between them, calling her name softly. She chirped in response, a brief, sharp note, then shifted forward cautiously, paw landing gently on the snow before retreating a half step, tail flicking twice in careful rhythm. Each movement was deliberate, calculated, and yet threaded with relief. She had ventured into the wild, and now she chose to return. His heart swelled with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and quiet relief. A profound, breath-holding moment where all the hours of worry, all the trudging through pines and snow, condensed into a single fleeting miracle. She crept forward, sniffing the air, whiskers vibrating as she measured the scent of the cabin, of Thomas, of the familiar world she had temporarily left behind. Her chest rose slowly, her limbs tense yet controlled, and for a moment she froze, amber eyes searching the tree line as if confirming that the wild beyond still existed, yet recognizing that here was safety, warmth, and trust. Thomas remained perfectly still, feeling the snow press lightly against his boots, the crisp scent of pine and frost filling his lungs, listening for the subtle crunch of her paws against the powdery earth. Then, with a delicate chirp that sounded almost like a sigh of relief, she crossed the final stretch, brushing against Thomas's gloved hand as he extended it slowly. He felt the warmth of her small body press against him, the faint vibration of her soft purr-like chirps resonating through the snow-damp air. Tail flicking twice in rapid succession, ears swiveling forward, she seemed to say without words, "Mote him back, and mote trust you still." Thomas exhaled slowly, chest loosening as the tension that had built over days of absence melted into quiet, profound joy. For several long minutes, neither moved. Luma sniffed the ground around his feet, her small paws pressing softly into the snow, whiskers twitching, tail curling in delicate arcs. Thomas whispered her name, voice low and reverent, and she chirped again, a melodic punctuation of recognition and relief. The wind rattled the pines softly, carrying the faint scent of the forest, yet she did not retreat. She had chosen to return, and in that choice lay a trust deeper than any words could express. His heart throbbed with quiet awe, understanding that sometimes the smallest acts, a cautious step, a chirp, a flick of the tail, carry the most profound weight. He led her gently back toward the cabin, lantern light warming the path. Each careful pawfall a reminder of her presence and choice. She paused frequently, sniffing, circling, tail flicking twice before proceeding, always attentive to him, yet fully in control of her movements. The trust between them, built slowly over weeks, had endured the absence, had survived the cold and the unknown. Thomas felt a quiet swell of humility, recognizing the fragility of wild hearts and the strength it took for them to return. As they neared the porch, she leapt lightly onto the steps, tail flicking twice before settling comfortably in her sun-warmed spot, whiskers twitching, ears rotating at every subtle sound. Thomas knelt beside her, offering the familiar blue enamel mug of warm water, and she sniffed it delicately before drinking, chest rising in soft, even beats. Her presence was steady now, measured, confident yet still tender, a delicate balance that spoke of reassurance and reclaimed trust. The tension of the past days lifted slowly, leaving only warmth, relief, and an enduring sense of connection. Evening found them together in the cabin, lantern casting soft amber light across the worn wooden boards. Luma curled along the rug near the hearth, tail flicking twice before tucking beneath her, chest rising and falling in quiet rhythm. Thomas sat nearby, sipping tea, inhaling the faint scent of pine smoke mingled with her fur, feeling a depth of gratitude that words could scarcely capture. She had returned, whole and deliberate, and the bond they shared had been affirmed anew. A silent promise that trust, once respected, could endure absence, danger, and uncertainty, leaving only quiet joy and deep, abiding connection. In the days following her return, the rhythm of trust between Thomas and Luma deepened in subtle, profound ways. The delicate dance of shared space resumed, but now it carried a quiet reassurance born from ordeal. Each morning she would approach the porch as before, tail flicking twice, ears swiveling at every sound, yet her movements were slower, more measured, a testament to the cautious wisdom gleaned from her brief absence. Thomas noticed her sniffing the air with renewed curiosity, whiskers quivering, as though confirming that this world, now reclaimed, was safe once more. Meals became a tender ritual of reaffirmation. Thomas would set the small plate of shredded chicken and kibble in her sunlit patch, and Luma would approach with deliberate caution. She sniffed first, then pressed her nose lightly against the edge, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, and finally began to eat. Between bites, she would lift her head, amber eyes finding his gaze, tail flicking twice as if to punctuate a silent acknowledgement. Trust restored, connection renewed. Thomas often murmured soft words, the warmth of his voice blending with the faint smell of pine smoke curling from the hearth, the crisp scent of melting snow lingering from the porch. Beyond the essentials of sustenance, they resumed their playful rituals. Luma would circle the porch, inspecting corners and edges, tail flicking in precise beats, whiskers twitching with keen attention. Occasionally, she would bat at a stray pine cone or chase a fallen leaf, pausing afterward to glance at Thomas as if sharing the joke of her own antics. The familiar rhythm of stolen socks returned too, though now she seemed almost ceremonial in her choices, carefully selecting one item, carrying it to her chosen sunlit spot, and settling upon it with a quiet pride that warmed Thomas' heart. Thomas found joy in observing the subtle shifts in her behavior post-return. She had grown more discerning, more expressive in her gestures. The tail flicks became a nuanced language of mood, the chirps varied in pitch and duration, and the positioning of her ears spoke volumes. He noted the way she stretched fully in the sun, paws extended and body relaxed, as if reclaiming her confidence. The gentle swish of her tail, signaling Beote hat contentment and alertness. Even the smallest quirk, the tilt of her head when inspecting a new sound, felt imbued with meaning, each movement a testament to the trust they had painstakingly nurtured. The cabin, once a tentative space of exploration, now felt entirely shared. Thomas would sit with his tea, inhaling the warm blend of pine and fir, while Luma patrolled the perimeter of the porch, occasionally circling back to brush against him in a soft, delicate gesture. He observed her with quiet reverence, recognizing the resilience it took for her to return, and the courage embedded in every careful step. The wild heart he had come to love was now both free and tethered, confident in the safety offered by a companion who had waited patiently through absence and worry. Evenings were slower, more reflective. Lantern light cast gentle shadows across the snow-streaked boards of the porch, flickering softly against Luma's delicate form as she settled into her sun-warmed spot or crouched at the threshold in her characteristic vigil. Thomas would murmur her name, noting the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the subtle twitch of whiskers, the flick of her tail twice in measured cadence. These micro-moments, so small to an observer but monumental in the intimate language they shared, reinforced a bond strengthened by trial, absence, and reunion. He also observed her tolerances subtly shift. She allowed longer periods of proximity, brushing against his coat more deliberately, sometimes curling near the hearth while he worked or read. She would pause mid-step to acknowledge him with a chirp, then continue her exploration. A nuanced rhythm of independence and connection that felt like a conversation conducted entirely in small gestures, measured movements, and silent trust. Thomas marveled at the resilience of her spirit, the intelligence in her choices, and the gentle humor that threaded through her quirks, now amplified by the delicate balance of safety and self-determination she exhibited. Even in moments of play, there was tenderness. She might low-e-a-pay lightly onto the railing, tail flicking twice before settling, ears alert, whiskers twitching as she inspected the air. Thomas would observe from a few steps away, mug in hand, offering quiet acknowledgement and attention, never intrusion. Each pause, each flick, each chirp was a testament to the quiet power of patience, the importance of space, and the depth of connection that could emerge when trust is honored, respected, and reciprocated. The days unfolded in a gentle, persistent rhythm. Food, sunlit patches, soft chirps, playful thefts, porch patrols, and shared quiet. Thomas had stopped believing that wild hearts could linger, yet here Luma remained, present and deliberate, expressing herself fully, revealing layers of personality, and reaffirming the bond that had been tested and proven resilient. Each measured step, each attentive gesture, each micro-beat of tail and whisker was a quiet promise. Trust had returned, joy had returned, and the connection they shared would endure, evolving in subtle, profound ways as the days stretched on. Weeks passed in a rhythm of gentle routines when Thomas introduced a new rescued creature into the cabin, a small raccoon named Pippin. He had brought Pippin in from the same ridge where Luma had once been found, and the little masked face, twitching nose, and nimble paws carried both curiosity and cautious intelligence. Thomas was careful to introduce them slowly, mindful of Luma's independence and the delicate trust she had cultivated. The air in the cabin smelled of pine smoke, damp fur, and the faint tang of fresh water, the sensory tapestry of life resuming its quiet, intimate dance. At first, Luma watched Pippin from her usual porch vigil, tail flicking twice with careful attention, ears swiveling like tiny radars, eyes bright with measured curiosity. She chirped softly, a short, questioning note, before retreating to her sunlit patch to observe from a safe distance. Thomas knelt nearby, watching the micro-gestures that had become his language. They kept at her. The tilt of her head, the subtle flick of her tail, the slight quiver of her whiskers. He understood that trust extended not just to him, but now to the new presence in their shared world. Each gesture was a negotiation, a delicate calculation of risk and familiarity. Gradually, small interactions began. Pippin, bold yet tentative, would approach the edge of Luma's territory, sniffing carefully at the rug or the threshold where she liked to patrol. Luma's tail flicked twice in quick beats, ears pivoting forward, body poised but not aggressive. She would chirp softly, a measured, musical note that seemed part question, part command, establishing boundaries without fear. Pippin would back off briefly, then inch closer, guided by her silent instruction and the subtle warmth of the cabin's routine. Thomas felt a swell of quiet pride. She was extending her trust beyond herself, inviting another small life into the fold with patience and grace. Over the next days, the cabin became a study in nuanced communication. Luma observed Pippin's movements, sometimes stepping forward to gently swipe a paw near a scattered piece of kibble, tail flicking twice to assert playful authority. Pippin chirped and chattered in response, ears swiveling, eyes bright and round, learning to navigate the unspoken rules of this shared space. Thomas watched each micro-interaction, noting how Luma's posture shifted subtly when asserting comfort, how Pippin mirrored or responded, and how the rhythm of trust extended to accommodate another being, delicate and precise. There were moments of humor and tenderness intertwined. Luma would sometimes steal the tiniest scraps of Pippin's food, whiskers twitching, tail flicking twice in mock triumph, only to allow him to reclaim them moments later, with a gentle chirp. Occasionally, Pippin would climb onto the porch railing, chest puffed, tail twitching in imitation, earning a measured flick of Luma's own tail, as if to say, "You may join, but only so far." These small exchanges, playful, cautious, intentional, deepened their shared understanding, a living dialogue of respect, curiosity, and emerging companionship. Thomas marveled at how Luma had grown, not only in confidence, but in social awareness. The independence that had defined her Pe-o-Roche hot vigil now coexisted with a protective attentiveness toward Pippin. She allowed proximity, yet maintained her boundaries, a delicate balance of inclusion and self-assertion that seemed beote hot, natural, and learned. Her amber eyes, usually fixed on the edges of the forest, now softened with moments of quiet connection, watching the raccoon with interest and gentle oversight. Evenings were particularly revealing. As snow fell lightly outside, blanketing the porch and softening the forest edges, Luma would curl near her sunlit patch, Pippin nestled nearby, whiskers twitching in concert, tails flicking in parallel rhythms. Thomas would sit quietly with his tea, observing the choreography of gestures, listening to chirps, soft squeaks, and the subtle shift of paws against wood and rug. He inhaled the mingled scents of pine, damp fur, and warmth, feeling the extraordinary intimacy of a small family united by trust and care. Through these interactions, Thomas witnessed the expansion of her heart. Luma, who had once cautiously engaged only Vekepite had him, now extended her trust to Pippin, demonstrating patience, guidance, and the quiet authority of a wild heart tempered by experience. Each day, she revealed more layers of personality, the mischievous streak, the playful cunning, the gentle mentorship, and Thomas felt the cabin itself hum with vitality. The wild, once hesitant and wary, had blossomed into a quiet, tender ecosystem of friendship, observation, and unspoken affection. The bond between them deepened subtly but unmistakably. Luma's tail flicked twice in careful beats whenever Pippin ventured too close, her chirps measured, eyes bright but never harsh, teaching lessons in boundaries and trust. Pippin's responses grew more confident, more attuned, reflecting the wisdom of her gentle guidance. Thomas sat back, sipping tea, marveling at the intricate dance of personalities, micro-gestures, and trust that unfolded daily in the cabin. He understood that their small family, built on patience, attentiveness, and quiet affection, was stronger for the trials they had endured, and richer for the new life they now nurtured together. With Pippin now a familiar presence, the cabin settled into a rhythm that felt both lively and tender. Mornings began with the soft crunch of snow under paws and boots, the faint scent of pine smoke curling from the stove, and Luma circling the porch with her usual vigilance. Tail flicking twice, ears swiveling forward, she paused occasionally to glance at Pippin, who mirrored her movements, Vekepite, had awkward but eager curiosity. Thomas watched them both with a quiet smile, tea warming his hands, marveling at the delicate choreography that had emerged, a blend of independence, trust, and the subtle, wordless negotiations that defined their shared life. the mail carrier ritual persisted. Each afternoon, Luma would position herself at the threshold, body taut with alertness, tail flicking twice as if counting beats, whiskers vibrating as she observed the world beyond the porch. Pippin sometimes attempted to join, climbing to the railing or circling her sun patch, but Luma remained calm yet firm, chirping softly to remind him of boundaries. Thomas often noted the humor in these tiny interactions, the seriousness with which she claimed her post, the way she seemed to judge every passing bird or falling leaf. Yet the affection underlying her authority was unmistakable. Their shared days unfolded in routines that were small but profoundly satisfying. Thomas would prepare breakfast, leaving morsels for both Luma and Pippin, the scent of warm chicken mingling with pine smoke, while the two creatures navigated their micro-world of sunlit patches, rugs, and porch steps. Luma occasionally stole a scrap from Pippin's pile, tail flicking twice in playful triumph, then allowed him to reclaim it. Moments later, ears swiveling vague capite hot precise calculation. The cabin hummed with a quiet vitality. Chirps, rustling paws, the hiss of the stove, and the faint scrape of snow-laden boots outside. Evenings were softer, more intimate. Lantern light painted golden halos across the wooden boards, highlighting the warm curve of Luma's fur and the delicate mask of Pippin's face. The two companions often curled near each other, tails flicking in small synchronized beats, whiskers twitching in shared curiosity or gentle mischief. Thomas sat nearby, watching the choreography, sipping his tea, inhaling the mingled scents of pine, fir, and winter-esque crisp air. He felt a quiet, profound contentment. The wild hearts he had come to love had found trust, friendship, and rhythm in their shared space, and he had become part of their story without ever forcing it. The subtle humor of daily life never waned. Luma would occasionally bat at the hem of Thomas's scarf, tail flicking twice as if demanding attention, only to retreat to her sunlit patch with precise dignity. Pippin would mimic her movements, chirping in imitation, and Thomas would laugh softly, the sound echoing in the cabin's quiet, cozy warmth. Each interaction, though small, carried enormous weight. Trust maintained, personalities expressed, boundaries respected, and the joy of companionship amplified by observation and attentiveness. Even the snow outside became a participant in their shared narrative. Flakes would drift lazily onto the porch, settling on fur and wood alike, and Luma would pause mid-step, tail flicking twice, whiskers quivering, before resuming her patrol. Pippin would scatter a few flakes with tiny paws, chirping in delight. Thomas marveled at the way these tiny rituals, sun patches, stolen morsels, porch vigils, tail flicks, knitted together a sense of home and belonging for all three. The cabin had transformed into a space where wild hearts could exist fully, in all their intelligence, playfulness, and tender caution. At night, the two animals would settle into their favored spots. Luma at the threshold, chest rising in steady rhythm, tail curled neatly, eyes half closed in contentment. Pippin nearby, whiskers twitching as sleep overtook him, tail flicking in tiny beats even in slumber. Thomas would sit close, lantern casting soft light across the room, inhaling the quiet warm scent of fir and pine smoke. The forest outside remained wild, untamed, yet inside, a delicate ecosystem of trust, companionship, and affection had taken root. Through these routines, Thomas realized the profound depth of their connection. Luma, who had once been wary and solitary, now allowed another creature into her sphere, extending patience, mentorship, and tolerance in ways that spoke to her intelligence and heart. Pippin, in turn, thrived under her guidance, learning boundaries, observation, and subtle cues. Thomas witnessed, daily, the intricate dance of personalities, micro-gestures, and unspoken communication, the subtle, enduring fabric of trust, intimacy, and playful joy that now defined their shared life. Evenings grew longer as winter pressed on, snow piling softly against the cabin walls, drifting across the porch where Luma maintained her watch capite, hat tail flicking twice, and ears swiveling at the faintest sound. Thomas would sit in his chair, mug of tea in hand, lantern casting a warm amber glow across the wooden floorboards, and watch her curl at his feet or settle near the threshold in her characteristic vigil. Her amber eyes reflected the lantern light, glimmering with intelligence, calm, and the subtle satisfaction of a wild heart that had found safety, companionship, and rhythm. Each rise and fall of her chest, each soft chirp, each careful movement felt like punctuation in the story they had written together, an ongoing narrative of trust, patience, and shared life. Thomas reflected quietly on the journey that had brought them here. The first hesitant steps onto the snowy porch, the tiny breaches of trust over cracked treats, the playful theft of a left sock, the tense hours of absence when fear had gripped him, and the miraculous return that had reaffirmed their bond. Luma had taught him more about resilience, patience, and the quiet power of choice than any human companion ever had. Even in her subtle quirks, tail flicks, chirps, and deliberate paw placements, he saw intelligence and emotion, a mirror of the careful balance he had learned to maintain between offering freedom and extending trust. As the snow fell outside in soft, deliberate flakes, he watched her stretch in a sunlit patch still illuminated by the lingering glow of the lantern, chest rising in gentle rhythm, whiskers twitching. Pippin, now a familiar part of their shared space, napped nearby, chest rising and falling in synchronized rhythm, tail twitching in quiet beats even in sleep. Thomas felt a profound, grounding gratitude. The forest beyond the cabin was still wild, unpredictable, and indifferent, yet within these walls, trust and care had shaped a small sanctuary of shared life, intelligence, and gentle companionship. He considered the arc of their days together, the cautious first encounters, the slow acceptance of hands and hearth, the mischief that revealed personality, the moments of worry and absence, and finally, the enduring trust that had survived every trial. Luma's presence, once hesitant and fragile, now exuded quiet confidence and comfort, a living reminder of the delicate, persistent work that bonds all creatures, human and wild alike. The rituals of daily life, stolen morsels, porch patrols, chirps, tail flicks, sunlit stretches, became symbols of connection, miniature milestones in a relationship built on mutual respect, observation, and unwavering care. As night deepened, Thomas leaned back in his chair, inhaling the mingled scents of pine smoke, damp fir, and the crisp winter air seeping through a crack in the door. Luma's eyes met his briefly, amber depths calm and watchful, tail flicking twice as if punctuating a shared understanding. The bond they had nurtured was steadfast, enduring, and resilient. He realized, in the hush of this quiet evening, that the wild heart once so tentative had not only returned but thrived, extending trust, teaching boundaries, and sharing a subtle, profound joy in everyday life. Outside, snow continued to drift over the ridges and pine boughs, the forest silent yet alive. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth, light, and life, a testament to patience, care, and the enduring promise of connection. Thomas ran a hand along the wooden floor, feeling the pulse of quiet life beneath his fingers, listening to the soft chirps and rhythmic tail flicks that marked each moment. He knew with a deep, steady certainty that some wild hearts, once trusted, never truly leave. They linger in the rhythms of daily life, in the subtleties of gesture and gaze, and in the quiet wonder of shared moments. The night settled slowly over the cabin, snow falling in soft, unbroken sheets that muffled the world beyond the porch. Lantern light cast a golden glow across the boards, flickering gently against the subtle contours of Luma's curled form, tail tucked neatly around her paws, ears twitching occasionally at distant sounds. Pippin slept nearby, whiskers quivering in quiet dreams, tail flicking in tiny, precise beats. Thomas leaned back in his chair, hands wrapped around the warm mug, inhaling the mingled scent of pine smoke, winter frost, and the soft warmth of fir. Each detail felt sacred, each breath a quiet acknowledgement of the life and trust nurtured here. Outside, the forest remained indifferent, silent in its snow-laden stillness, yet inside the cabin, a delicate ecosystem of care and companionship thrived. Luma, once wary and cautious, had returned fully to her place in this shared world, her intelligence and gentle authority shaping rhythms and rituals, creating a sense of home that reached beyond mere shelter. Her amber eyes reflected trust, contentment, and a subtle joy, each flick of her tail and chirp a punctuation in the ongoing story they had written together. Thomas watched her, heart quietly full, aware that this presence was both fleeting and enduring, a miracle of patience, attentiveness, and unwavering respect. He reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Hesitant first steps on frosted boards, stolen morsels and socks, the tension of absence, and the miraculous, careful return. Each micro-gesture had been a chapter in a delicate narrative of trust, resilience, and quiet affection. Even now, as Luma stretched in a sunlit corner illuminated by lantern glow, Thomas felt the soft thrill of recognition. That bond, once tested, had deepened, blossomed into something subtle yet profoundly enduring. As snow drifted softly beyond the cabin walls, he whispered her name, careful, low, reverent. Her eyes lifted briefly, amber depths calm and knowing, tail flicking twice, a gentle promise that some wild hearts, once trusted, never truly leave. Thomas exhaled slowly, the weight of days of worry dissolving into peace. So, dear listener, thank you for staying through this story, for sharing the quiet moments, for letting your heart travel alongside ours. Breathe in the warmth of trust, the rhythm of shared life, and the enduring miracle of connection. Sleep gently, friends, knowing that some bonds once nurtured linger in ways words cannot capture, softly, persistently, eternally. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.